Award section. We're welcoming Michael Martell and Ian Byrne for a presentation. And just to give you some background on the Minorities in Economics Best Paper Award, it's basically a prize that is given to outstanding research in the fields of LGBTQ+, ethnic, religious, minorities, and people with disabilities. This is the first year that we're awarding this prize, and we started with a presentation in the beginning of January with Federico Ricca and Francesco Trebi with their paper on minority representation in US cities. And we're now very, very much looking forward to having Ian Byrne, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool, and Michael Martell, who is an associate professor at Bard College, who are also, as I know, very much involved in the AEA committee on LGBTQ+ rights, and also you're organizing a virtual seminar. So I'm encouraging everyone to join these as well. You are the runner-up to the prize. This was really fascinating work. The whole committee was very much excited about this new approach on gender typicality and the labor market differentials of people with different sexual orientations. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a 20-30 minute presentation throughout which you're able to ask clarifying questions. I've talked to Ian and Michael, and they're happy to take your questions as we go along. And then we'll have the last 20 to 30 minutes for an open discussion. So congratulations, Ian and Michael, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Lovely. Thanks a bunch, and thanks for having me. All right. Yep. As Sulin said, I do run like a weekly seminar, virtual seminar on the economics of LGBTQ+ population. So if you find the topic interesting, you can send me an email and I'll make sure to get in touch with you. And another logistical thing, I'm in a different time zone and I have to teach at the top of the hour, so I'm promptly going to leave, which means I'll start off the presentation, and then I will unfortunately leave Ian to clean up all of the questions or all of the unclear things that I said in my absence. So sorry if I leave quickly at the end. And then here we go. Are you all able to see? Is screen shared okay? Lovely, thanks. All right, so I'll try to keep this to 20 minutes so there's more time for discussion. And if you have a question, I'll have trouble seeing the chat or your hand up, so feel free to unmute and holler. I'll let go and I'll stop talking. And so our paper, Gender Typicality and Sexual Minority Labor Market Differentials, pardon the January 2022, it's today. And so our paper is kind of situated in the larger literature on the economic and earnings differentials that lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals experience. And by now there's over 25 years of economic research that has pretty regularly, with some exceptions, found that gay and bisexual men earn less than their heterosexual counterparts, and lesbian women, but not necessarily bisexual women, earn more than their heterosexual counterparts. There's a little bit of evidence that these differentials might get even smaller, although there's no consensus on that one. And importantly, there's no general consensus on what the underlying mechanisms that are generating these differentials are. Although people have long thought that gender typicality or masculinity and femininity could play a role, but it's difficult to quantitatively measure these things, we think. And part of the reason why there isn't consensus as to the underlying mechanisms generating disadvantage is that the data landscape for sexual minorities is not particularly great. Data where we have self-reported sexual orientation is rare. For example, in the Lee Badgett's seminal article, she used sexual behavior to infer sexual identity in the General Social Survey, and that involves only a few hundred responses. If we want larger sample sizes, usually in the US context, we infer sexual orientation via cohabitation status, which is not without its problems. But regardless of the method researchers have used to infer sexual orientation, cohabitation status, or sexual behavior, or the rare occasions when we have self-reported sexual orientation, like these asymmetric earnings differentials by sexual orientation keep popping up. And there seems to be about 4 broad explanations for what could be happening. And so some people have supposed that lesbian women might earn more and gay men might earn less than their heterosexual counterparts because of different patterns of household specialization, whereas like women who cohabit with a woman might spend less time in the household than a heterosexual woman that cohabits with a man. That could be there's some underlying unobserved difference in preferences that vary by sexual orientation. The differences could be due to discrimination based off of sexual orientation, although that's a bit less straightforward to explain a lesbian premium when that happens. Or maybe the differentials are due to underlying differences in gender typicality that vary by sexual orientation, which is the question at hand for us. And so there's a number of ways through which gender typicality could matter. And so employers and coworkers could have implicit or explicit biases for masculinity. And so, some people have posited that biases towards masculinity over femininity could be leading to some of the stalling of the gender gap. And if lesbian and bisexual women are perceived more masculine than their heterosexual counterparts, and gay and bisexual men are perceived less masculine than their heterosexual counterparts, these biases could lead to differentials we see. And even in the behavioral and mannerisms that could come up, or that could come up in perceived household roles that map into what people, how dedicated to the labor market people think LGBT individuals are. And then so this is how gender typicality could matter, but then also the impact of gender typicality could also vary by sexual orientation. Because sexual minorities could be perceived as double violators of gender typicality in more than one way, and so the penalty could be larger. Or being gender atypical as a sexual minority could be one way of could also conform to broader social stereotypes, and so the penalty could be smaller. Either way, we could theorize for a long time about a number of different mechanisms through which gender typicality could affect labor market outcomes. But then that brings us to how it's not straightforward to how we would then go on and measure gender typicality. We typically think of Sandra Bem as being a pioneer in measuring gender typicality via the Bem sex roles inventory. And so Bem's approach used a series of questions, and then you would implement via survey, and then you could add up the response to the survey. And according to the responses, then the inventory could categorize you as masculine, feminine, or androgynous if you're high or low on both of those, on the masculinity and femininity scores. The Bem's inventory has been criticized a fair bit for being pretty essentialist. So she created it on a single cohort of students, and then when and where we implement the sex role inventory, the survey items don't change. And then if we think of gender as being something that is performed, or something that is performed in relation to others as a social construct, what is masculine and what is feminine probably depends on the time, place, and culture in which it's performed. And so more recent developments in quantitatively measuring gender, right, what we've fall under gender diagnostic techniques, have developed ways of relaxing the essentialist nature of the Bem sex role inventory by using and which is the approach that we use. And so instead of having a predetermined set of questions, we use a data-driven approach where we can use survey items in larger data sets that have gender differences in responses, and then we can then predict measures of gender typicality based off of it. And the benefit of this approach, the more relaxed nature of it, is that the questions that we use could depend on the time and the place in which the survey is implemented, reflecting that gender is performed in a particular social context. Yeah. All right. And so what we do, we take a series of survey items, calculate the items that have statistically significant differences by sex, and then we take the most significant differences and we predict via logit the probability of being like male or female. And for men who have the higher predicted probability of male, indicates that you have a higher gender typicality. Yeah, and so then instead of measuring masculine and feminine, our continuous measure of masculinity tells us how much more masculine in relation to other members of like your particular context you are. Yeah. All right, and so this type of approach has been used pretty broadly in other social sciences, public health in particular. And so it's correlated with risky health behaviors, it's correlated with academic performance, but we're not aware of as many economists that have kind of brought moved beyond the gender binary in empirical work. And so the way that we implement it is we use the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, which is a longitudinal sample of that began of young students in the US in 1994. There's been 5 waves or 4 follow-ups surveys of these students, the most recent being in 2016, 2018. And what's handy about the ad health for this particular purpose is it includes self-reported sexual orientation. It has information on labor market outcomes of interest, a bevy of individual characteristics. And so we can look at differences, gender differences in responses and things like hobbies and interests and individual behaviors. And so we're going to look at gender typicality, the impact of it on reported annual income, hourly wages, employment, whether or not one's working, and usually weekly hours of work. Yeah. All right, let me check the time. Oh yeah, we're okay. All right, and so we follow the Fleming et al. Method for the gender diagnostic approach. And so we start with every single variable that's in each wave of the ad health. We exclude those that are biologically based, those that are demographic, and those with more that have either 300 or more missing values, or they're respondent, in which the question doesn't ask about the respondent, but asks like the respondent a question about the world. We do a test for significant differences between male and female. We exclude all of the, we exclude survey items with the least significant differences in responses. And then we keep going, we go through we do a manual stepwise regression to then to identify the subset of predictors that are the strongest predictors of being female or male. And then when we arrive at our final set of questions, we save the predicted value each individual has and standardize it so that we have a continuous measure of gender typicality. Sorry, if I butchered that, unmute and ask and I can clarify. Yeah. Okay. All right. And so just to give an example of the things that go into our measure of gender typicality, the survey items span quite a wide range. We have like frequency of crying, whether or not you drive or use sunscreen, or your risk-taking behavior in the first wave. In the second wave, or in the third wave, we use different questions. We have like questions about physical activity, owning a gun, damaging property. Some of these things we would think of as being conforming gender stereotypes. Some of we wouldn't. Here's the questions in wave 4. And maybe a thing about these is that these questions don't seem that they should be immediately related or correlated to labor market outcomes. But collectively, they do correlate and they map into like gendered behaviors and how people are probably perceived. And just in case I wasn't particularly clear, in constructing our measures of gender typicality, here is the gender typicality questions used in wave 4, and we use wave 4 gender typicality for wave 5 labor market outcomes to avoid, reverse causation. All right, and here you can see the distribution of gender typicality in each wave. And so you can tell, if you look at the distribution, one thing that is pretty clear is that LGB folk are more gender atypical than their heterosexual counterparts, right? So the tails are less pronounced. And then as we go from each wave 2 to wave 3 to wave 4, as people age, they become a bit more gender typical. All right, and so if you have questions about the reliability of the measure, and the measure has been repeatedly used in the public health literature, and being more gender typical, which we think of more masculine among men, is correlated with increased likelihood of smoking, recreational marijuana use, and prescription use. And amongst women, if we think about it as femininity, is correlated with less substance use, which kind of is a pattern we would expect. Within the ad health, we also show that it's strongly correlated with marriage for heterosexual individuals in a way that we would expect. And it's also correlated with how individuals report that they are perceived in the Wave 5 data, right? So women who are very gender typical are also more likely to report that they are perceived as very feminine in their appearance, and the reverse is true for men, which bodes well for the paper. And so if I've given you a brief convincing spiel that the measure is useful and important, or reliable, the way that we then invest its relevance for the sexual orientation-based labor market differentials that we observed in the broader literature, we apply this into, we estimate standard labor equations to estimate differences in earnings, wages, employment, and usual hours work. We include an indicator for individuals reporting that they are LGB, to first estimate sexual orientation-based differences in these outcomes, and then we stepwise add our control for gender typicality to see if controlling for gender typicality leads to attenuation of the sexual orientation-based differential, and then we add the interaction of the gender typicality measure with sexual orientation to see if the effect of gender typicality varies by sexual orientation. Yeah, and then we include like the standard series of controls and all these specifications: age, race, ethnicity, occupational attainment, whether or not one's enrolled in school, occupational attainment, and then some individual effects that are typically unobserved, like cognitive ability, physical health, and religiosity. So we kind of follow Joe Savia's work that he's done in the ad health before, and then we use standard school fixed effects, wave fixed effects, and we cluster standard errors at the high school level. Yeah. All right. I'm going to go through the results tables, and to avoid ocular trauma, since we have so many outcomes, maybe one useful way of trying to follow along here is that, like, here in the top two rows are the coefficients on being gay and bisexual. And so we have a statistically insignificant 8% income penalty for gay men, and a significant 26% penalty for bisexual men. If this is due to gender typicality, when I move to the next column and control for gender typicality, these estimates should get smaller. But what we see is that they don't, right? The insignificant differential for gay men is of the same size, and the bisexual men, the penalty for bisexual men is essentially unchanged. But what you do see is that here in the third row, that gender typicality matters, right? Men who are more gender typical, right? If you want to think of it as masculine, earn 3% more, right? Or a 1 unit increase in gender typicality leads to a 3% increase in income, right? But controlling for gender typicality and its interaction with sexual orientation in the bottom two rows does essentially nothing to the estimated differentials in income. Yeah, and if we do this in wages, where the difference for that gay men experience is statistically significant, right? We see that controlling for gender typicality does essentially nothing to the wage differential gain bisexual men experience, even though gender typicality measures in ways that we would expect it to. More gender typical men earn more, but the impact of gender typicality doesn't vary by sexual orientation, right? And we see the same thing amongst employment. There's no statistically significant differentials, but controlling for gender typicality does nothing to them, right? And then on the, and then on the hours margin, again, we see a larger differential for bisexual men. Controlling for gender typicality matters in ways that we would expect, but once again, it does essentially nothing to the estimated differentials that gay and bisexual men experience. Yeah, and we see the same thing in all of our patterns for women, right? We see a 5%. Our 6% penalty in income bisexual women experience is unchanged by controlling for gender typicality, and it doesn't vary by sexual orientation. On the wages margin, we see a similar pattern, but then when we're controlling for gender typicality, it matters in the way that we would expect it to. More gender typical women earn less than earn more or earn less, which would be consistent with the penalty for being feminine, but it doesn't explain the differential bisexual woman experience. And this is also true on the employment margin and the hours margin, right? And so in summary, our baseline, our estimated differentials reproduce what we've learned broadly reproduce what we've learned in the past 25 years. Gay men earn less per hour and work fewer hours per week than heterosexual men. The differentials that bisexual men and bisexual women experience are larger than their gay and lesbian counterparts. Gender typicality, right, in a quantitative sense, is an important predictor of labor market differentials, right? More gender typical men have better outcomes than less gender typical men. More gender typical women have worse outcomes than less gender typical women. The role of gender typicality appears to be larger for men than women, but gender typicality doesn't explain very much, if any, of the differentials that LGBT people experience, right? And then this pattern is pretty robust. You could be concerned that when we separate gay and lesbian individuals from their bisexual counterparts, that we're underpowering the sample. So if we combine LGBT people into one group, our pattern of results is the same. We can, instead of entering gender typicality linearly into our equation, we can be able to be nonlinear, and our pattern is largely robust. We can let the impact of gender typicality vary by wave and sexual orientation. We can exclude sexual minorities from the calculation of gender typicality, or we can toss out our quantitative measure of gender typicality and just include for the series of survey items that predict it. And our finding is our pattern of results is still largely the same. There's also not very much evidence that heterogeneous effects of gender typicality are also kind of masking the important role that play. And so we looked at allowing the effect of gender typicality to vary by educational attainment, whether or not respondents live in a state where sexual orientation-based discrimination is illegal. We did it based on, we allowed the impact to differ if sexual minorities were cohabitating or not. And we also varied it by race and ethnicity. All of these led to essentially the same pattern of results. The only time when we saw some meaningful variation is that the return to gender typicality for men is highest in occupations that are predominantly male, and the reverse is true for women, which we probably is a finding we might expect, but it's also something we should probably, right? So being more masculine or more gender typical has a higher payoff when you're around more men. Yeah, which is maybe something we should look at a bit more into the future. All right, and so to conclude, I think I took a bit more than I had intended to. There's a significant correlation between gender typicality and labor market outcomes for men and women. Right? Masculinity seems to come with a premium, particularly for men, but the gender typicality, either differential levels of gender typicality between that vary by sexual orientation, or is the return to it doesn't explain the sexual orientation based labor market differentials that we observe. Yeah, and this finding is pretty robust. And so then maybe one thing we can conclude from this is that it could be more evidence in favor of the role of discrimination or alternative explanations, but more fundamentally, we think that this is some evidence that moving beyond a gender binary in empirical work has some payoffs and it could help us understand labor market differentials and the impact of other members of groups. We might also be able to think about applying it and understanding how it's the relationship between gender typicality and organizational productivity when we have notions of fit and culture and how people work together. It also highlights that gender typicality or biases for masculinity and femininity may also may damage more than just women, right? They also damage men or they may cause harm for gender atypical men in addition to gender typical women. And we should start looking, and there's probably a robust research agenda where we could look at those things. But I'll stop talking now. Oops. And pass it up for questions. And also, Ian, sorry, I forgot to add your email address. You could contact me or Ian. It's our paper, not mine. Sorry for flying right through these. Sorry for what is invariably going to lead to some confusion that Ian will have to as I run off to class in a couple minutes. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Michael. I think you were very clear. And if there are any remaining questions, I would like to turn to the audience. And I think you can either raise your hand or just speak, since we're not a very big group. While the others are thinking, I will abuse my monopoly power as a moderator and ask you something right away, if that's okay. So I was wondering whether you see any sort of evidence about how stable or varying this gender typicality is within individuals. So do you see that the same people over time change according to your measure, or is that something that we would think of as stable, or how? Because in addition to a non-binary measure of gender typicality, it's also could potentially be a time varying measure. Yeah, so I was wondering whether you've thought about this or have any evidence on this.
Yeah, so it's somewhat stable within an individual. There's a significant correlation between your scores in a past period and your scores in future periods, but it's not 1-to-1. So I think it's only for men it's about 60. The correlation coefficient is about 60%, and for women it's about 70%. But you did see when we moved from wave to wave, the distribution is definitely shifting. And I think that sort of reflects that the way that people think about their genders and how they have to portray it does change as we age. Teenagers and young adults are much more concerned about this, so you notice a much more polarized distribution of answers, where people allow themselves to be a little bit more non-conforming in different aspects of their lives as they sort of get more confident in themselves. So it's not as stable within an individual. It does change over time, but I think the unfortunate thing with ad health is we get snapshots every 5 years where, so we're kind of seeing, quite large jumps, as it were, from, you're in college, now you're a young adult, now you're in your 30s, and now you're in your 40s. And so I imagine that we are seeing differences, but it's probably pretty slow to change. But, if you looked at some of the things, it's like wearing sunblock. You might be more risk loving when you're young because you want to be tan. And then as you get older, you start realizing, oh, I need to be wearing sunblock. I'm going to be a little bit risk averse around some of these things. And so there's just a natural changing as we're aging. But that's what makes our measure really important, is because it's not grounded in a specific time period. So like other measures fix the distribution or the questions kind of when you're 18. And we do, it is important to allow it to move as we age and contexts change.
I see a question by Sankurt.
Yeah, thanks for a really good presentation. So I was just wondering whether you have any information about the industry that these individuals are working, or whether the type of job that they're doing. So I was thinking, if they're working at a high-skilled job, maybe the room for discrimination would be lower by the companies, or if they're working for, at a retail company, then they can be discriminated easily, whether this is by the pay, or whether this is by the hours, or whether this is like just being a full-time employee or a part-time employee. So I was wondering whether this survey has any information about this and whether you looked at this one.
Yeah, so we know industry and occupation. We looked at some of this heterogeneity across these, and we really only found things within occupations. So within occupations, we do see very different returns, as we were saying. So male-dominated occupations seem to value masculinity a lot more than female-dominated occupations. But importantly, female-dominated occupations don't really seem to value femininity that strongly. And so there's this little bit of an asymmetry about the context where typicality really plays a role, and we start seeing quite large premiums for conformity versus penalties for nonconformity. So yeah, I think this is like a really, what stood out to us was this result in terms of where should we be going with this? Because I think it's sort of an underrated aspect for a lot of the occupational choice literature. And even bringing it further back to think about something along the lines of like college major choice. Like, we're in sort of these male-dominated spheres versus some of these more gender neutral spheres, conformity and social norms may be much more binding. And that may definitely play a role. So I think there's a lot of dynamics within occupations. The ad health is a bit restrictive because it's not that large of a sample. So we definitely are not capturing the full breadths of occupations. So this is definitely something that, like, if you're interested in it, is a really promising area to go forward.
And just one thing to add. Do you have, for example, the students' cognitive and non-cognitive skills when they were, let's say, 17 or 18? Because I think,
yeah, so those are included in our giant vector of unobservables, because that was, definitely part of it. Is there just something going on with like background characteristics? Because so much of the questions themselves are also sort of, there's definite elements of class as well as, can you be doing certain sports depends on how much resources your parents have. So there's definitely, we can condition on whatever we want for the individual level, and a lot of these results stay robust.
I see, thanks.
David.
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. I mean, your colleague's gone, but still, thank you very much. And this is a really exciting topic. And I just have a very narrow question about one aspect that, because it's all very fascinating, to focus on the measurement of masculinity and femininity. And I feel like a lot has changed in recent years, and I'm sure you all have similar experiences, what it means to be masculine or feminine. It's also subject to a lot of trends. And I was curious, with this amount of data, do you see a shift in age cohorts? I know it's a pretty narrow sample, but especially at that age, a lot can happen in 6 years. So I was just curious if there are some big changes in what predicts masculinity or femininity when you compare these people who are 5 to 6 years apart from each other.
So it's a single cohort of people, and so it's a bunch of high school students in 1995, and then it follows a single cohort through. And so unfortunately they do it like every 5 years, so we haven't quite hit a lot of the current discussion in the data. So that's going to be a lot of the wave 6 results. But yeah, I definitely think you notice sort of the question shifting over time. And I would be really curious if you could kind of map some of those shifts, to a more, quantitative aspect of what's the discussion of gender. And, because gender typicality and gender nonconformity wasn't even in the discussion when wave 5 was being put into the field. So like people just socially weren't aware of this, where now it is such a common aspect in pop culture that potentially people's conception of their own gender might be influenced by this. So I think if you could, but that's where like the ad health is kind of restrictive. So if you had other data sets, what's nice about this method is that as long as you have a huge panel, a huge sort of cross section of random social questions that, you can draw from that ask about things that we think might be correlated with sort of how you present your gender, you could actually replicate this in a lot of different contexts. Like I know some people have been using the Stockholm birth cohort survey to replicate this method in Swedish data and to generate long-term outcomes for a lot of these gender typicality things using a much older cohort, because you get, we're trapped in sort of the mid-30s, but with Stockholm birth cohort, you can go up into the 60s in terms of ages to really get a nice pattern. So I think it's a really flexible method that, like, if this is something you're interested in, is definitely a we're kind of the first people to do it. So it's like, it's a wide open sort of field for anyone really thinking about these issues.
Thank you.
Stefano, please.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Now, I had just one question about this. When talking about income, if I remember correctly, you find a penalty for bisexual people, but not for gay people. And I was wondering why do you think is the case? What's going on there as a first question? And second question, I was wondering a bit, what are your ideas about the result that you find? So Like broadly speaking, what do you think? Why do you think the typicality is not explaining the gap? What do you, if you have other mechanism in mind somehow? So like a broader discussion on the result. Thanks.
Sure. So starting with the bisexuals, it's kind of an open mystery. It's a little bit odd that we keep finding much worse discrimination against bisexual individuals for both men and women. But this is sort of a persistent pattern in the literature that we have across any outcomes we look at. Bisexual individuals are much worse off than gays and lesbians. So if you look at educational outcomes, health outcomes, it's a consistent sort of story. Potentially it might just sort of be a weird sort of, they're discriminated against because they sort of are a sexual minority, but also it's like straight people discriminate against them, but then also there's discrimination coming from gays and lesbians as well. And so potentially just the uniqueness of the bisexual identity and experience is just a distinct concept from gays and lesbians. But I think it also goes back to just their outcomes are worse along a number of dimensions, so that by the time you get to income, we've already had differences in grades, we've had differences in, just levels of, risk preferences are different across the two groups. So there's a lot going on that this is a really distinct group, and that's why it's very important when you're doing research on the LGBT community to make sure that you pull out bisexuals as their own group rather than lumping them together. Because potentially the results are significant and it shows both negatives, but it really hides a lot of the nuance in the experiences of bisexual people. And then moving more broadly, I think it is a bit of a puzzle. I think discrimination is probably the most likely answer, mixed with a little bit of the household story. It's probably not one thing. I think people were relying on gender typicality to not have to deal with discrimination or some of the messiness around household stuff, because I think those are a bit more contentious debates that both sides kind of don't want to be having. Where if gender typicality the answer, it's a classic omitted variable bias, and we're all quite comfortable by saying, oh, there's an omitted variable that we can't see, but this is probably it. And so I think what we do in our paper is kind of show that this is sort of a boogeyman that's been floating around the literature since 1995, where everyone's like, we'd love to control for this, but we can't. So take everything we say with a grain of salt. So at least we're able to remove that avenue and let people kind of focus on these more complex issues without having to constantly be batting back against referees or editors who are saying, but you don't have gender typicality. I think it's really helpful for narrowing down the parameter space of what's going on. But I think there's a lot still to be done sort of with different theories and how do they interact. Because I think because of the data sizes, people are quite limited where they look at one explanation. And I think people need to be more ambitious to start looking at cross-cutting and intersectional kind of aspects of a lot of these different explanations.
Thank you very much.
David, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to abuse the possibility of asking questions, but this is really interesting. So interrupt me if someone else wants to jump in. I might be missing like an obvious reference to this in the paper, but I was just curious, what about people who do not identify as male or female, and how is this treated in the data? Because it's also interesting to turn the question on its head and to think about what comes before, what drives people to be not gender typical in their behavior and their experiences, because this is also, like, I think, a really open question. Of course, sexual orientation, this is as shown in your graph, is a factor, but there may be other aspects that we're not even aware of and who might also be related to labor market outcomes.
Yes, it's buried in a vague footnote on the documentation of ad health, but there's no transgender or gender nonconforming people in the sample. So it's quite a small sample. So when transgender people are about 0.01% of the population, and then it's about 0.05% for gender or probably 0.5% for gender nonconforming, 0.1% for transgender. and there's only about 12,000, you know, so we're expecting a handful, and unfortunately, the sampling just didn't find any. So every time someone indicates they've changed their gender or their gender identity's changed, they call them up and double check with them to make sure that it wasn't a miscoding and that they actually meant to do that. And every time there's been a case of mismatch or changes over waves, it always ended up being a miscoding issue. So they've been checking for this to make sure that they're, you know, adapting the questions for that sample. And then, unfortunately, for our case, it's just never been an issue that they've encountered with the sample. But I think if you had a different cohort, you know, a Gen Z cohort, because these are like the eldest of the millennials, if not the last of Gen X. So you're going to have very different, you know, gender nonconformity is much more common in Gen Z. Millennials, there's a little bit, but it's quite small. I mean, the majority of nonconforming people are Gen Z itself. So you're not going to really see very many of them in sort of these older cohorts, but you will, I think, see a very different conceptualization amongst Gen Z. And I think that's what's really interesting, is that no one's been able, you know, so far to find consistent surveys in a country across multiple cohorts, and then construct consistent measures in each cohort to look at how things are changing from cohort to cohort. So I think that's going to be a really important discussion. You know, because if you think, you know, removing gender nonconformity, which is interesting in and of itself, even the conceptualizations of femininity and what it means to be a woman and how do you present as a woman have shifted drastically from baby boomers towards millennial women. And so the gender nonconformity in femininity and masculinity within even, you know, people who are gender conforming and cisgender, I imagine my a priori guess is that we've had a bit of a widening, and that the distributions have gotten a lot wider over time, where nonconformity becomes a bit more acceptable in the late 80s and 90s, and then it absolutely explodes with Gen Z. I imagine that Gen Z would have very few predictors that would, or the predictors would look so weird to us, having done everything on this Gen X millennial kind of cross cohort. So yeah, I think you're going to see very stark differences for the gender nonconforming population, because I think they have such a different conceptualization.
Thank you. And do you see any clustering in the data about people who are gender non-conforming, or who are non-gender typical in their behavior or experiences? Is there some common characteristic, or is this just kind of an innate characteristic of people that's distributed evenly over, let's say, regions or ages and occupations?
So there's a little bit of it. I think there's sort of pockets. You have to think of like this in a school context. There's definitely pockets within a school where you're going to see a lot more of it. So I think when we were looking at it, nothing's like super strong because we have very small sample sizes within a school. So once you do like a regional fixed effect, you know, based on the school, you lose a lot of your variation for these things. And then you're kind of dealing with like 20, 30 students at a time. So when we looked at the major ones, such as race and stuff, we weren't finding a ton, but there was some evidence that you're going to see different conceptualizations. Like, so African-American students in the 90s were much more conforming relative to what you were seeing elsewhere in the white student population or the Asian student population. Asian men typically are a little bit more gender nonconforming, but if you looked at the questions, it's because they definitely hew a bit more towards academic interests rather than sports. And since a lot of the early questions were very predictive of physicality and like how often do you go to the gym, do you play sports or do you play football, those were quite, you know, start between the two groups just based on those natural things. So you'll get some sort of differences there, but I think it all kind of comes down to sort of what's acceptable. And you definitely do have cohorts and groups within schools where you have a lot of clustering and they have very low variation in answers because everyone's afraid to be non-conforming. But are they actually different is kind of the key question. We really rely on people to tell us what they're feeling and what they're willing to share. because they're filling out these surveys in the early stages in the classrooms. So you kind of have like everyone going through the survey on their own together. And so you're sort of balancing these tensions of what you really want to be doing versus what you're presenting to the world. And so you do notice some correlations based on sort of probably, you know, what these groups are like and what the student groups are like.
Very cool, thank you.
Ian, if I can jump in with another question. So if I think about the research on minorities and discrimination based on race, for instance, we're kind of moving away from this idea that, you know, race is something that is intrinsic to specific people, but it's more of an ascribed feature by your surroundings, right? And it can change substantially depending on the context that you're in. Your measure of gender typicality is based on sort of self-reported experiences and behaviors that are sometimes very private or not so easily observable, right? So my boss doesn't know how often I apply sunscreen or what I do, you know, in my free time. So how do you think about, you know, the observability of this gender typicality, whether it's also being read as such by the people around you? And related to that, your measure is also based on within cohort preferences. So you're basically anchoring gender typicality within the same sort of, you know, age bracket. That may be very different in the labor market, right? Where I would assume that, you know, gender typicality is much more compactly distributed with thin tails, and where, you know, being gender atypical happens at a much different threshold than what we actually see when we compare within cohorts. So how do you think about, you know, the context in which this plays a role in the people, how observable that is? Do you have any evidence in your data that speaks to that?
So unfortunately, we don't know where you work or who you work with, because I think that's a really interesting point, is that everything here is to your peers, and we're sort of removing age fixed effects or sort of cohort fixed effects, where like you may be, you know, the people judging you are going to be a different generation who have their own expectations. But I think the key aspect and the way we think about it is that it's sort of a wide range of answers, and it gives us a really nice view of who you are as a person in the way that you're answering these things. So even though you may not like constantly talk about how much sunscreen you apply, those types of behaviors your employer is going to see relative to someone else. You know, so when you're talking about what do you do on the weekend at the water cooler, that conversation people are going to experience, and you're going to be talking about that with people, you know. And so some of the things like how often do you cry are kind of a bit odd, but they're really probably strongly correlated with how emotional do you get under stress or in certain situations. So it's sort of, you know, we really get a sense of who's sort of clustering in terms of their behavior and their answers and really trying to look like everyone else versus who's more comfortable standing out from the crowd. And you definitely, I think, when the crowd is made up of a lot of different generations, and you know you have dominant and people in the crowd who like everyone wants to emulate, I think you're going to get a really different answer across some of these measures. But again, I think it's also a bit, you know, when we think about, you know, looking, you know, if we take our own perspectives and we look at the students that we teach, a lot of times we sort of go, okay, you were all Gen Z, you were then different. And so my expectations for you as a person are anchored in, you know, your peers. You know, and what I expect from Gen Z is going to be very different from if I'm interacting with someone from my generation, where we share this a very similar kind of set of norms. Because I see Gen Z wearing things where I go, I would never be comfortable wearing that, even as someone who is quite comfortable bouncing between conformity and non-conformity in different situations. And so I think it's kind of important, you know, to really think about who's setting the norms, because here we're kind of letting the norms be driven by your peers, but that may not be the case in the labor market. It could be the boss, and the boss is from a generation where you have a much more compact sphere. So then what they consider non-conforming could be much wider, or it could be, there's any number of different ways that it can be operationalized within a firm environment. But I think it's important that it's more about sort of you as a whole person and how you're perceived through small interactions, because that's really the idea of the gender performance from Weston, Zimmerman, and Butler, is that gender isn't, you have your own private sort of gender, which is you as a person, but we're always, in the way we present ourselves, filtering that through the ways that we want to be perceived. And so understanding the questions through that lens of everything is a bit, what are you willing to tell me? What are you willing to show to someone? But these are going to be the types of things that people will catch through multiple iterations, or they're going to catch glimpses of it and see you be different. And so, will an employer notice one question? No, but they might notice differences across, multiple interactions and sort of intense, working environments. And so it just depends on the actual firm dynamics, how that gets expressed, and what then are the mechanisms through which conformity leads to either pay increases or, non-conformity generates penalties.
Thank you, Ian. Are there any other questions? If this is not the case, I'm sure Ian and Michael would be happy to get your emails. And I would like to thank you again, Ian, and my thanks also to Michael for this very interesting work. Congratulations to the runner-up prize for the Minorities in Economics Best Paper Award, and wish you all the best. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thanks everyone, it's a wonderful event.
Thanks, Ian, thanks so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Have a nice
you.
day.